Welcome Wargamers, Doug here from 2 Plus Tough, and today we are continuing our coverage of the Seasons of Warthandia book by exploring the nature of the Incarnates themselves. Now, if you're new to Age of Sigmar and you have no idea what I'm talking about, in the latest campaign supplement that's come out for AOS, they introduced a new kind of unit to the game, and that is the Incarnates. And at the most basic level, they are essentially the realms have come to life, and that magic, if it's focused in one point hard enough, will gain a sort of crude sentience. They're somewhere between an actual monster and an endless spell, and we're going to unpack that concept here today. And the way that I would really, I guess, kind of do a sum up, if you will, regarding the Incarnates is that they are essentially the consequences of all of the actions that we have read about so far. And when I say read about so far, I mean like all the way back to before Age of Sigmar began as a setting. Everything was peaceful, the forces of chaos invaded, and during the Age of Chaos, the realms themselves have been tainted and corrupted and twisted in all kinds of weird ways by all the various chaos gods and burrowed into their core by the Skaven, and all these terrible things are happening to the landscape. Well, then the Age of Sigmar begins, and now we have forces of order trying to reclaim and dominate some of those things. And as that's going along, Nagash, god of undeath, comes along and tries to take a home field swing for this whole deal by killing everyone and turning them into zombies, effectively cutting off the chaos gods from their followers. But he botches it, and all of a sudden the Necroquake happens, which essentially destabilizes magic as we know it in the setting. It has the biggest, most pronounced effect on Shyish, the Realm of Death, as it basically inverts it into a giant siphon. And normally in realms, the edges of the realm are where it's the most dangerous because it's where the magic becomes kind of untethered. But for Shyish, he inverts it to now the center is the craziest point of death magic. And this chapter saw spells coming to life and being predatory and all these deals. And then we had the Broken Realms saga, which saw Alariel doing her own ritual called the Rite of Life. Meant to kind of reverse the effects of the Necroquake, right? Death magic is past, now we're going to infuse life magic, but here's the issue, and here's why I call the Incarnates a direct consequence of everyone's actions. It doesn't work, I feel, as intended. We don't really know much about Alariel's motivations. I'm really hoping we get some books that bring her into the story. But it seems to be when she did this right, the various magics all across the realms were, instead of being banished, because it's not a ritual of banishment, they were given some sort of crude tether to the real world. It's life magic, so everything kind of gets magnified, everything grows just a little bit. And so, at random points in the realms where there's lots of geomantic power or concentrations of realmstone, wherever magic might be extremely intense, her rite injected just a little bit of, we'll say, consciousness into it. Sentience might be a bit much, but some kind of crude animalistic consciousness. And this is where we get an Incarnate. Now, this was introduced to us in the Seasons of Warthandia, the story we just covered here on the channel, where essentially the Stormcasts are going to this mountain range in Ger, and they notice a huge hunk of realmstone at the center of this swirling vortex beast that brings up bones, and there's a lot to unpack with their kind of sighting of what is now we know as the Incarnate of Ger. But that's essentially what it is. Ger itself, through being destabilized by Nagash and then invigorated with a primordial consciousness by the Rite of Life, have begun to take form themselves. So they don't owe allegiance to anybody. They're a totally neutral party, but they can equally devastate everybody because the realms themselves have been poisoned, conquered, reconquered, twisted, broken, shattered. I mean, all the actions you can think of from the various, stories we've told, everything from the Rumgate Wars and the slaying of Behemoth, Archaon poisoning the heart of the entire setting at the 8 points, all these things have ramifications, and now those ramifications have just been given the spark of life. And so in this video, rather than just talking about the specific, the Thondian Kronspire, what can we learn from this one setting? Because it's the only Incarnate we have at the moment, but what can we learn about it and apply that logic to other Incarnates? Well, there's a few possible things that this one can teach us. Namely, Incarnates represent the realms that they're powered by. So, that's a pretty basic one, right? The ones that appear in Ger are going to be very animalistic, very primal, because they represent that magic. However, what might not seem like an obvious thing is that because Realmstone has been moved by mortals and tectonic activity, like there's realm gates underground, and so like resources will pour from one place to another, they functionally have been known to appear just about everywhere, meaning your Ger incarnate could also appear in Akshi, Realm of Fire. As long as there's a hunk of, Gerish, Realmstone there, Amberbone, I think is what they call it, the Incarnate of Ger can appear. And that's a very important thing because, just kind of stepping back as a gamer perspective, Incarnates can work for any faction. So they can be anywhere, they can work for any faction. If you have an army and you want to include it lore-wise and have a lore-friendly thing, it's everywhere. Don't worry about it. But what's important to note is they do kind of exude whatever magic they represent, no matter which realm they're in. So our Ger incarnate, if he shows up in Akshi, is going to infuse whatever region that he is in with all kinds of Gerite power. And so now you can kind of mix and match the effects of various realms into creating wild, almost impossible combinations. And I like that idea quite a bit. What does an incarnate of life look like if you take it to Shyish, for example? Like, those are the kinds of questions I'm like, I want a scene of all of these things. Now, of course, for the ones that we know about Ger, I can point out a few. Mortals will become kind of like hunched, stooped. They'll grow like long fingernails, big tufts of hair. They'll kind of become more beastly versions of themselves. We even had a story from Seasons of War Thondia where like the Stormcast just broke down, like dropped their weapons, were running on all fours like wild animals and just snarling. They couldn't speak anymore. Again, they became the beast because they were near sort of like the focal point of pure beast magic that is the incarnate. So I think logically, it kind of seems as if there's a big enough hunk of Realmstone and enough magic happening, it'll form an incarnate, and being near it is just like being near the edges of any other realm, where the magic of that realm is unstable and also truly representative of the realm itself. So like in, the realm of metal, Chaman, you might turn into gold as you transmute randomly near the edges of the realm, because transmutative properties are a big part of metal-focused magic. So I imagine, therefore, the incarnate of Chaman would be very similar. If you get near it, it'll start to warp and twist the materials that you yourself are made of, which sounds all kinds of metal, no pun intended. We also learned that these creatures, whatever they are, can be bound to someone's will. There might be different levels of intelligence, we'll talk about that in a second, but it does seem that if you are a powerful enough wizard, sorcerer, or character, you have a strong enough, soul and presence and mind, if you walk up to it, you can get it to lock into you. Basically, it'll recognize, oh, this is a powerful mind. How exactly it bonds is not a lot of detail given. In the actual story we have in Seasons of War Thondia, we arrive on the scene with Andrasta to see that it's already bonded to a Wurgog prophet, but we don't see that whole scene where he has to walk up and like tame the thing with his will. My gut reaction is to say, the Kronspire is a naturally occurring incarnate, and he walked up to it and just exerted his will over it, and since it is a natural thing with primitive consciousness, it kind of just snapped into line. Again, that's just a guess. Important to note that even though they're bonded to it, they're not immune to the effects that it does. So if you bond yourself to the Ger one, you will still feel the effects of becoming more and more bestial and feral and all that. Another thing we pick up from that same story, though, is the idea that they can be forming without being anchored in reality. Meaning, there's a battle where there's two sorcerers fighting, I think it was a Great Bray Shaman and a Wurgog Prophet, and just because they are unleashing enough magic, one of these Ger incarnates begins to form and ultimately explodes. We are then explained to by the exposition goat that it doesn't have a Realmstone core, and therefore they tend to fall apart, almost like pop like a balloon. And that means two things to me. One, that it's very important that they have a Realmstone anchor, so that's good to know. That if it doesn't have that missing ingredient, it will dissipate after the battle. Really important. But also, secondly, it means they can exist while a fight is happening. These can be temporary or permanent creatures. If they're permanent, they can be bound and you can control it and bring it into battle. If they're temporary, at least in this story, this guy just exploded and it just took out both armies. Like everyone was knocked to their butts. which could also make for a really cool way to use that in your battle tactics. Aside from a big hunk of realm stone to keep them tethered, it's a little hazy on what actually forms these things. I mean, there's obviously ley lines and places of geomantic power, spell casting in great quantities will do it. But the big issue is that there just needs to be a high concentration of power in a particular place and a realm stone there to anchor it. So they are, I'm going to say, probably very rare given the grand scope of things, but it's important to know that there are multiples of each. They're not characters, they're just these little wisps of the realms that kind of gain sentience for a bit. So there are multiple Kronspire Incarnates of Ger. Some of them are in Ger, some of them are in other realms, which is really important for both storytelling purposes and kind of setting, expectations for where these things would appear. And really the last thing I want to touch on here in terms of information that we're given is that these things seem to have a quite massive radius of effect. In the Thondia book that we are given clues about the Stormcast, as they're approaching it, and they're like 5 days march away, they start to notice that they become a little more animal-like, a little short-tempered and such. As they walk towards this mountain, they're at the base of a mountain range, and they see humans, and they are just losing it. I mean, some of them have like fangs and long claws and big old patches of hair. Some of them just grunt at each other like they're actively losing themselves to this beast form, which is important because at that point in the story, they're less than a day's march away from this thing. So you think, 16 miles or something like that? That it would be able to affect the people in this city away from it? Because it took them the rest of the day to walk up the canyon, then they got attacked. So it might be less than that, but regardless, there's still a huge space between where the actual Incarnate is and where these people are that are being so dramatically affected by it that they're like beginning to physically change, which is nuts. I mean, it makes sense if you're right next to the thing, the eye of the storm, whatever, but it's different when it's just a huge area that's being warped and twisted by these effects of the realms that are supposed to largely be kept to the edges. Now, of course, that does intensify. Like I'm talking about the range of the effects, but it only gets more intense the closer you get to the point where Stormcasts are crawling on all fours, like I talked about earlier. And I'll read this little bit here because it speaks to their intelligence. Some incarnates are akin to territorial beasts, but others are more intelligible to mortals. It is possible to communicate with them, but their temperaments vary wildly, from childlike naivety to jaded bitterness and outright hatred. More sinisterly, there are entities spawned amidst regions corrupted by chaos that revel in cruelty. And so again, we see more of that reinforcing of the theme, the consequences of what all of our champions, no matter what Grand Alliance or faction you're a part of, the consequences of all these things happening have dramatically changed the realm to the point where certain aspects of it are twisted and make monstrous, and others are very reasonable. I'm sure the ones in Hish are just like, hey, you want a cup of tea? Right, super chill, super on the level, very enlightened. Meanwhile, the one in Akshi is like a moving, 80s guitar metal band video made manifest. So I like the spectrum is what I'm saying. So you can have yours be a wizened, Incarnate of Ger from the mountain who has hunted many winters, all the way to a primal monster that has no sentience at all. And so taking a step back and asking, why is this cool? Well, for the longest time, people have got really hung up on the idea of there being consequences. Like, what are the consequences of the Realmgate Wars, or the Necroquake, or the Rite of Life? And what I see the Incarnates as is the representation of the consequences of the story. Yes, it's also adding a new thing, and yes, it has new rules, and, it has questions of its own that haven't been answered yet. But on the whole, I love the idea of the realms have their own self to them, and they're tired of this. We saw glimpses of that when it came to the Lumineth Realm Lords, that they can commune with certain aspects of nature in the realms. And yes, the mountains themselves have individual minds, but the whole of Ger itself, and thereby extension Akshi and Hish and all these different realms, they're tired. They've been twisted and morphed and beaten and conquered and reconquered and shelled, and god beasts are dying, and all these things are happening all over the place because of the setting that's happening with Age of Sigmar. That there just had to be a natural tipping point, and it was Alarielle's Rite of Life that sort of birthed this thing. Now again, we don't know a ton about that ritual, no idea what her intention is. It kind of seems like Nagash pissed everybody off, and then Alarielle, to fix it, pissed off the planet. You know what I mean? Like, it was just this next level, like, what? Why did you think that this would fix things? But regardless, that was her plan. And I'm kind of here for it. I like when things escalate. What I would like to hear, though, is your opinion on this. Obviously, you know, the model itself is, at the time of recording, buried in a terrain set, which I think is unfortunate. But the concept and the model itself, like in its own vacuum, I love. I actively love it. And I love the concept of it. This idea that your ramifications come alive, and that all the little cheats that the various deities thought that they could get away with are suddenly coming back to haunt them. Because we do have huge nodes of power that aren't related to any of these things. And here's what I mean. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a story where the aqua purifier that these various Dawnbringer crusades have, what if that erupted because it hit the right amount of magic, and now you have the incarnate of life magic swirling in the middle of your camp? It would be a disaster. Same thing goes for those penumbral engines that Sigmar originally made to like cover and disguise his storm vaults during the Age of Myth. Like, what if each of those exploded and an incarnate of Ulgu started unleashing shadow magics on everything nearby, and essentially in the process broadcasting where all of these storm vaults are? It would be madness. Like, that would be really cool if they breached into the topic of like other uses for Realmstone are also becoming unstable because of these things. I think that would be rad. I'd love to hear your thoughts of how to use these more effectively for storytelling and how to kind of take, you know, this chapter of Age of Sigmar to the next level. Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to read it. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.